Alrighty, in this first tutorial we'll be working on a fun little project to check whether an item is in stock in an online shop using Python. We'll first check a given website using a Python library called BeautifulSoup, which is perfect for parsing websites. We'll then send an email to a target email address if we determine that that item is in stock. We'll also keep a log of this activity so we can understand what's been happening. And then finally we'll set this all to run automatically so that by the end of it you'll have a bot that will automatically periodically check this website for the presence of an item. In our example, a PlayStation 5, which can be in short supply. So let's get started. I'm using Visual Studio Code as my IDE here. There are many good ones out there. I particularly also like PyCharm, but I've been getting more into the flow of VS Code. So let's do it here. Let's just create our file. Save this as name.py in our project folder. And let's also set up a virtual environment. Now we can do this in our folder with the following command, python3, run the module virtual environment and install it in this folder, .venv. It's important and useful to use virtual environments so that the modules you install that are relevant for this project are contained within the virtual environment and don't mix with other projects or other virtual environments. It's a really good practice to use that. Many ways to activate that virtual environment. I just ran the code there using the terminal in Visual Studio, assuming that you have Python installed here. And let's start importing some libraries. So the first part of what we wanted to do was to check the website in question. In my example, I'll be looking at PlayStation 5s, since a friend of mine is desperate for one so that he can play Farming Simulator 22 with all the blades of grass crisply rendered. So I wrote something similar for him. So let's import BS4 from, well, BeautifulSoup from the library BS4. So let's install this library then to have that. That should go with pip install BS4. Since we're in our virtual environment, this command should go there. Okay, perfect. So now we see that no warning remains for the dependency. What else do we need? I think we're going to call that website with just the request method from the URL library. So let's bring that on board. And we want to be emailing stuff. So let's import, look at email.message to import that facility. And we'll be keeping track of our log. So let's bring in datetime, which allows us to access the current time. And I think we'll be using a credentials file to store our username and password for the email sending, and perhaps the from and to address for emails. So let's store those as JSON, JavaScript object notation. And what else do we need for emailing? I think if we're going to use Gmail for our import email, let's import smtplib as well. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of ingredients, and let's get going. So what to do is define some kind of main method and call that if the name of this method is main. So why is that? We do this because otherwise, if we were to ever import this module into another piece of code, this main method would get called called automatically upon import. So if we had this here in this class like that, which we don't want. Instead, if we ever call this from the command line, let's say, and this is the main thread that's running, we know that this is going to be called this function that we're defining here. Okay, so what do we want to do here? We want to check whether that file exists. Okay, so let's create another method. And how should we build this? Okay, so we want to find a page. Now maybe we should pass that in. URL. So we can define our URL. So in my case, what I want to do is check for the presence of PlayStation 5 in this particular web shop. Great. So there's this Finnish web shop, where if you look for PlayStation 5, it will give you this web page. My thinking is, here it says the PlayStation 5 consoles are temporarily out of stock. So we're going to go to this website and look for the presence of this phrase. And if that phrase is missing, we're going to assume that something's changed, and it's quite likely that the stock exists. Well, we'll take a closer look. So we define the URL. In this case, we could have the user pass that in. Oh, I'm just coding it in here. How do we get to that? And let's say we will also have the target phrase. Yes, why not? So we're checking for a given phrase on that page. And that phrase, as we saw, was just this one. Doesn't matter what it is, even if it's in an incomprehensible language like Finnish. If we know what that is, we can rework it. In your case, whatever page you're working on, you need to figure out what's that piece that you're going to grab into. I'm going to use a very, very simple example here. So now we're going to open the page using our URL library. And we are going to parse that using BeautifulSoup. Features to use an HTML parser. Avoid an error. And basically, we could be more elegant about this, but let's say if we want to check for the presence of the phrase in anywhere on that web page, one way to do it is to just look at the whole text blob of what BeautifulSoup provides. And in our case, we want to return false if that phrase is there, right? So if the page is saying we're out of stock, they're out of stock, so it's not going to be available. But if they've changed the page and that phrase isn't visible, and that's a bit of a strong assumption, we will just return true. And this will at least spur our friend to get an email and go check the website themselves. Great, so here's our very basic availability check. Just going to go there. You can do a lot more with BeautifulSoup, I should note. You can pick out any parts of the page, navigate the document object model really handily, look at all the links, look at the headers, whatever fancy things you want. So it's very powerful. We're using it in a very brutal way here. And let's wrap this all in a try and accept block in case there's an error. So we can say, tell Python we want to give this a shot, and if we fail, what do? We want to add something to our log. So maybe we just say there is an error parsing the website. Something went wrong in our parsing. Now what's the log? Let's create an overall log that we track. More advanced logging methods available in Python. This is a very simple one. And we're going to have this global variable accessible here. So we're going to keep adding to the log each time we run this operation. Great, so now what we should have is a method that navigates to the page that we provide and then parses it using BeautifulSoup, checks for the presence of this phrase in that text of the soup, and if that phrase is gone, we will assume that the item is in stock. So in your use case, you might be dealing with a very different page structure, very different way of a place to notify if items are in stock. Maybe you want to grab onto a number, maybe a certain subsegment of a page, do something more advanced. Well, you'll need to read up a bit more around BeautifulSoup and figure that out for your individual context. This is just a very basic use case of looking at the presence or absence of a given phrase on a page. So now we know at this point of whether our stock is available. What else do we want to do? So presumably if it's not available, we just log and say it's not available. If it is available, we want to try and send an email, right? That's what we said we wanted to do. So how do we do that? Well, we can use our email message method that we've imported to generate an email. Okay, so we can give the subject and we can say who it's from and who it's going to, often very important with emails, I should say. So where do we get these from and to addresses? So we could define them right away, but actually I think it's better if we have a little config file where we have the username and password needed to log into the email page, whatever email service provider you're using, and also maybe the from address and the to address, so we don't expose sensitive information in our file in this case. So let's say that we have a config file, and I do have one. So I've prepared one. Let's see if I can bring that in. If we look at a blank one, I'm just going to have it like this. There's going to be a username, password, from address, and to address in a JSON format. So curly braces at the end, left side, right side separated by a colon, commas in between. And these are going to be filled in with the relevant details. So I've got a file for that, and then we can parse that file. Okay, so we can use our JSON library to open that file as a dictionary. So let's say that with open config file, so open it as a file and say that the config file is whatever comes up when we load the contents of the file as a JSON. Great, so now we can just say that the from address is whatever is in the config file that's been labeled from address. Great, and similarly, we can pick out the to address from there. Beautiful. And then we'll use the username and password a bit later. So we now set that up. What do we want to do next? We don't need to do these here. These can be done there. So we could just say that our username is whatever is the config username. And the password is whatever is the config password. In fact, we should move these here, shouldn't we? There we go. We can say from address to address. Beautiful. So we're continuing to compose the structure of our message. Let's set some content inside as well. And this could be elaborate. We can use the set content method and just say it seems that available at, and then might as well pass the URL. Make it easy for whoever opens the email to navigate to that page. Great. Now, we've developed our message, we've formulated an email message, but we still need to send it. So how can we do that? We can use our SMTP library to connect to Google's Gmail, and log in and send that message in this case. So we can use SMTP and point it SMTP to gmail.com. And you know the port should be 587, and they do tell you. Make it secure, and then we can log in. So knowing that my username and password should work. And then server should be sending a message, and the message is what we've just defined. We definitely want to quit as well. Okay, let me just show you how that ought to work. So if we've got our, just created a dummy email address for this. What I also want to do is look for giving access to less secure apps. I do want to be able to do that. So there's a way you can Google this and just allow less secure sign-in technology in our simple Python example, and allow it for the right email address. So our sender address. And now we should be able to send a message. So I suppose we could try this out. We can comment this and see how far we get. If we just run everything here. Okay, something happened, no errors, happy about that. Is anything moving in the world of moving? There we go, we get an email. So our Michael Pythonista has sent an email, and it's doing what we want it to do. Great, except it wasn't actually available, but that's fantastic. So that's all we need to send an email, provided we have an email account set up. Now, that's very basics of this. This is already doing what we want, or we presumably want. So we could, well, I know this works. We can test it. We could change the phrases to something that's not on the page. So then it would trigger that. Let's add a bit of logging before we make this run periodically. We've got our log here. We've got it tracking in the error. Maybe we have... I was going to also use the log to check that whether it's already been discovered once. So if the item comes in stock, we don't perhaps want the email to be sent every 10 minutes. We just want it to be sent once, unless there's a reset. So let's create a success message. Yeah. Great, and let's open that log file. So we want to refer to the global log variable, so the same that we've defined here. It's going to be the same, we don't need to pass it around. And we're going to open a local log file. So this is where we're going to read the log and write it. I think we're going to open it with the R+ flag. That means it's going to take it to the very end, to the very start. but it's going to be something we can write into. So if we were to use A for append, it would scan to the end of the file. Now we start at the start of the file, and that allows us to read it first and then append later. Why do we want to read it first? So that we can check if the email's already been sent. Let's say if this code is triggered now and then, which it will be. Okay, so let's do that checking. So if success message, we've already logged a success. Let's just end right there. Maybe we can tell the user. Great. We wanted to define the success message above. Makes sense. Great. We haven't added this to the log yet. So when do we add the success message to the log? We add it if we discover from our checking that it's in fact available. That way. Why not wrap this into a try and accept block? So we try and open our config, and if we fail in that, let's say we will log an error saying credentials file. I think we want a little space after these in case they get all concatenated on the same row in our log. So we're going to have a little space at the end for that reason. Okay, so we've wrapped a little bit of a try and accept block, and shouldn't be anything erroring there. That can be something erroring with the server connection. So let's say we should record a successfully sent message here. We could say something failed at that stage. Maybe a user can come in and investigate a bit more closely. And otherwise, and this is probably going to be our most common use case, so if it's not available, we've done a check, we'll just say, hey, it wasn't available. Load. Okay, so now we've appended things depending on what we discover into our log variable. Can we write it down? Of course we can. So we've created our log file earlier on. We will use our datetime method to grab the current time, just brutally like that, and then add whatever's in the log and a new line, and then close that file. So this should then generate this log file. Let's try and run this. There is no such file or directory. Well, that makes sense. Let's try a little creative, but we haven't created it. Let's just create it. It's empty. That should be just fine. We can say stop checking. Doesn't really matter. Okay, so we have at this time done a check and returned this message. So assuming our logic is right, it's happening because that phrase that we saw is still on the page and the stock is not there. Splendid. So this is all it takes. 70 odd rows. So what else do we want to do? Now, I don't want to be running this manually every time I want to check. That's going to save me very, very little effort indeed. Instead, I'm going to have this run periodically. Now, you could set it to run on your home computer using a task scheduler on Windows or cron on Linux, which I'm familiar with. And I happen to have a DigitalOcean droplet running all the time. I don't have to worry about my desktop being on or not. So that's where I'm going to stick this. into my DigitalOcean droplet. Clunkily with the password. Great, and I think we can go to the folder and make a directory. What do we call? Sure. Let's send our little file over there. How can we do that? We can use scp and the file name and send it to our destination. Check that it arrived. There we go. We've transferred the file over. Let's do the same thing for our config JSON file. Okay, great. So now I've got this, and we also wanted to have the log txt. Great. So now we have all the main ingredients. And assuming that we have Python installed and we have BeautifulSoup installed, which I happen to do, we should be able to run Python main py, Python 3 main py. What happened? We got a log entry, so it is running on our remote server. Great, and the last step then is to set it up as a cron job. So we can run the command cron tab-e for editing. And the way these work is that the syntax has stars at the beginning. So every minute, hour, day of month, day of week. As it says here, minute, hour, day of month, and day of week. So what we want to do is not, if we had 5 stars, it would run every minute of every day of every week, every month. Let's not be so cruel on the shop server. Let's say every 10 minutes. So we can divide the minute by 10. And then, okay, so this gives us the frequency. Every 10 minutes of every hour of every day. And you can limit this to what you think is reasonable. And then we say, what do we run? Well, we run the Python 3 executable, and what do we run with it? We run our Python file, and then we can type the output to a log file. That means that the activity from the Python file is going to be logged itself. So running of the Python terminal, so if there are things like errors, file not found things, are going to get logged in this cron log. We can take a look at if the cron job is failing for some reason. But that does it. So we can see that that should be running every 10 minutes. And it does in fact do that. It's going to use the Python 3 to run this Python program every 10 minutes, and we're going to see our log file increase over time. And there we have our beautiful, beautiful little stock checker. You can use this presumably for lots of different clauses, checking websites, sending a message when that's done. So thanks very much for your attention. Hope this was enjoyable and useful. Get in touch. Let me know how these things can be better, how you would have done it differently, and look forward to hearing from you.